to short and to the point. A podcast from the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Here's your host, Jessica Kleinschmidt.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Short and to the Point here on Awful Announcing and the Comeback. Jessica Kleinschmidt here. Did you miss me? I missed you. Obviously, we're in the thick of baseball, and it's nice to kind of take a break from that. Really excited for this episode with Howard Megdal. He joined me today. He's the founder of The Next and the Nine as in like the Roman numerals, IX. So if you find it that way, he's also the author of Rare Gems, How 4 Generations of Women Paved the Way for the WNBA. I didn't read the book in its entirety, but I was able to get some excerpts and read bits and pieces and how it's more than just about the sport of WNBA, the historical aspect of it all, leaning into the fact that a lot of women's rights just didn't exist not that long ago, which is crazy to think about. So it's more than just what happened on the court. I could talk to Howard about anything all day. He's also a baseball guy, which I appreciate. So here's my chat with him. Well, Howard's here. And before I get started, thank you so much for stopping by Short and to the Point. This is going to be an awesome conversation.
I have been a fan of yours for a long time. I'm very excited to chat with you.
And first of all, thank you. But I wanted to dive right in. And I was thinking about like, how am I going to do this intro? And I don't think there's any formal intro. So we're just going to get right into it with the meat and the potatoes of this book. Tell me more about Rare Gems. I would love to hear more about it and why you decided to write it.
So it's been a fascinating journey, and there are different stories that I was reporting out in my work over at, thenexthoops.com and over at the Nine newsletter. And I ultimately started to see these connections between the generations of folks who have made a difference. So, whether it's Peps Newman and Vicki Nelson, who are incredible pioneers who predate Title IX even, and were able to build women's basketball, and a lot of times themselves, just doing their own vision for it, which is amazing to me. You're not coming into any sort of established structure. You have to make the structure yourself. And I met them in the 2017 Final Four in Dallas and struck up a conversation and a friendship, and, ultimately saw these stories now impacting what we were covering, which is the very end of a group with the Minnesota Lynx that had done things in the WNBA no one has really ever done, and I would argue have not done since, to be in the finals consistently year after year, winning 4 WNBA championships, and the way in which they did it all struck me as connected. And then as I'm watching this next group come forward, I first talked to Paige Beckers when she was still a sophomore in high school, and you started to see and hear that Paige is different. You start to see Caitlin Clark as a high school player doing things. All right, this is different. And then they're so heavily influenced by the players who came before, in this case, these Minnesota figures, that it was remarkable to me. And then sort of that final tie-in was seeing the way in which the business of women's basketball changed in a couple of ways. Lindsay Whalen did it as a player herself at Minnesota, at University of Minnesota. Everything changed when Lindsay Whalen came on, and the model that Carly Knox, who's the president of business operations over at the Minnesota Lynx, and is married to Cheryl Reeve. So you have that connection between on-court, off-court. It was all linked, and the influence they're having on each other, newer generations on older generations, and vice versa, was remarkable to me. And so I knew it had to be told in book form at that point.
And I can't wait to talk about Whalen here in a little bit, because she has such an amazing story as well. But another person I wanted to ask you about was Rachel Banham. And what was it like to have her write the foreword?
It was such a cool thing. I've covered Rachel Banham for almost a decade now, which I can't really get my mind around, because she's
right.
Because
you're 12 years old, so that's crazy.
It is certainly, I have not matured in any way, so I assume I am. And for her to have been the figure that she was, not everyone remembers this, because it was a bit of a fallow time for coverage of women's basketball. But she was so big that Kobe Bryant is tweeting about her. She is the Maroon Mamba when she's playing at Minnesota. She scores 60 points in a game. You look at what the attention is now, and it would have been fundamentally different. But she got some attention. There's a little bit of pop. It's not on national TV. It's on the Big Ten network. A lot of times it's streaming on BTN Plus, so people weren't even seeing it easily. And then the night she's drafted, instead of it being this massive affair at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the way Caitlin Clark's year was, it was at Mohegan Sun Arena. It was, 2/3 empty, just a very different thing. So for her to see and understand her own role in this growth development, because what comes next doesn't happen if Rachel Banham doesn't take that ball and bring it forward, was incredible to me. And she's just so perceptive about the world around her. And women's basketball is just really lucky to have her in every conceivable way.
When you say she's perceptive about the world around her, what do you mean by that?
She understands not just in the moment what it is to be in the plane, but she's helping to build the plane in the air. And that's what's amazing to me. When we look back at this generation of players, the players immediately preceding Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers and like the stars who are coming through now. And I think Juju Watkins is going to be in that conversation very soon, as soon as she frankly gets to the pros. These were players who had to understand marketing because in a lot of ways, the systems were not there. Rachel Banham was helping to figure out how to build this in a way that, in a similar way, but at a more basic level, Peps Newman and Vicki Nelson had to when they built a team themselves to barnstorm in the 1960s. If you are working within a system that does not yet exist, you need to understand how it works if you're going to be able to build it. And that's what Rachel Banham does.
Do you think you've known her for 10 years. Do you think her personality in meeting her, that she understood there was responsibilities there for her?
Yes. And it's such an unfair responsibility, right? I mean, we know this. We've covered pro athletes. Being professional in any athletic endeavor is more than a full-time job by its definition. It's the same reason why, in Major League Baseball, why minor leaguers not being paid for the offseason has always been such a ridiculous idea, because they are, again and again, they're asked to do so many things. Being a pro athlete is this. Now you are asking Rachel Banham and many others to be also marketing themselves, finding a way forward, around a media landscape that pushes women athletes to the side again and again and again. So she gets it. She understood it. And then a lot of it is just living it as well. And she's just one example. Of course, there's so many players of this past generation, the entire group of the Minnesota Lynx who played in the 2010s are a great example of team that was winning titles. And when they weren't winning titles, they were coming damn close to winning titles. And at the same time, we're figuring out how to be important figures in building women's sports and important figures in building our society at large.
And it's interesting because with all that responsibility, like in my mind, like it's kind of their baby, and it's more than a brand. There's an extra responsibility like we talked about, but she called you an advocate. So in my mind, I would love to know what that term means to you, but at the same time, I feel like it's extra special because of the way that these sports are trying to be introduced to people, but they've been around so long. So to have you be an advocate, that's a lot of responsibility too. And there's trust there. So what was it like to know that she defined you as an advocate? That's beautiful.
It is. And it means a lot. It is also a balance that needs to be struck, right? So what we do over at the Next, what we do at the Nine is we are independent reporters and making sure that the coverage reflects reality, not boosterism, is, to my mind, the most important advocacy we can do. And I say that because there's been a lot of treating women's sports with kid gloves. There's been a lot of treating women athletes as if they can't handle the same level of toughness of coverage that men take routinely when it comes to sports today. And I've never bought that idea. It's always been an absurd idea on its face, but it also has a dangerously negative effect on people's ability to engage. People know when they're being BS'd. People know when they're just hearing puff instead of learning what is actually going on. And that's not going to ultimately take in and keep a fan base over a long period of time. And so what she knows is that being an advocate is not the same thing as being relentlessly, and I would say toxic positivity
I
has
hate
no
that.
place in
Yeah.
it. And so it's something I take very seriously. It's a conversation I've had to have with many people through the years of, look, I'm going to be here for the slump. I'm also going to be here for the highs. And
Hmm.
I remember speaking to a general manager of a team that I had covered some of the negative things that the team had gone through, and the team struggled. And the general manager got very mad about this.
Yeah.
And a year later, that team won a WNBA championship. And I remember saying to this general manager, do you understand now? Like, I'm always going to be here. I'm always going to be here. It's not always going to be positive. If you
Yeah.
miss shots, people are going to know you missed the shots. Like, your team is not
You're not
winning.
like walking up to them and saying, "Did you know that you missed that?" Like they're aware.
And
Yeah.
we're not, and it's never going to be a personal thing, right? Like it's
Totally.
never going to be you're missing all these shots because there's some deep personal failing within you. But you have to talk about what's going on. If a team is not gelling in the locker room, people are going to want to know about it if they care about it, because the enemy of this for everyone is indifference.
And you mentioned the GM, but what about other reporters too? If you're in, if you're around and covering it, were you singled out for being the person who was being, quote, too critical on genuinely what was happening?
That has happened at times. I've never spent a lot of time worried about that.
Okay.
I've always thought, but yes,
Yeah.
but you sit there and you say, look, at the end of the day, the way in which I think about it is that if I would feel uncomfortable saying something, looking a person in the eye and saying it to her face, I'm not going to write it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's being accountable. So if you do write something tough, I'm a big believer in that. I know it's sort of an old school idea, but you show up,
Hmm.
and you show up to to the locker in other sports, but the WNBA, for reasons we could talk about, doesn't have open locker rooms right now. But you make sure you have that direct interaction with a player, with a coach, with a general manager. Frankly, you do it before you write it in the first place. You give
Hmm.
people the opportunity to have their say.
I'm right there with you. I always respect somebody in the media who can go off about a player and then you see them in the clubhouse the next
Yeah.
day. I love people like that. Like they're not going to hide away from what they say. And I was thinking about that too. I had Lindsay D'Arcangelo on, and she mentioned the same thing about, if you're going to cover it like you would any other sport. And it's so weird because, I mean, to be fair, I've covered pretty much no women's sports. I can do, I've done so many baseball stories, and I've never really thought about putting myself in a situation where I'd be like, well, would I cover it a different way? And then alone that first thought means you're already kind of, I don't say dramatically part of the problem, but at the same time, you're kind of like, oh, okay, if I'm having that thought, that means no, like, why would you change? But the fact that I had that thought makes me think like, this must be a scenario if other people are thinking it too, because I'm having that thought.
Well, and there's more elements to it, right? Until a few years ago, the conversation about so many women's sports was about survival.
Yeah.
I've covered a lot of women's soccer through the years, and National Women's Soccer League is having significant success. And Jessica Berman, the commissioner, is a big part of that and her vision
Mhm.
for it. But it's worth noting that NWSL went through a ton of commissioners and a ton of problems, and there wasn't regular coverage. And when the coverage came along, the idea is, well, we've seen several other women's professional soccer leagues fail in this
Yeah.
country. How do you go about making sure that your coverage is helpful? I again ultimately believe in sunlight and maximizing people's ability to connect directly to it. All of it, the good and the
Mhm.
bad,
Yeah.
is precisely the reason why there's such a level of passion in Major League Baseball and and National Basketball Association and the NFL, and it goes on about that coverage mattering. But listen, thinking it through in that way, also, we don't necessarily need, if there are ways to change the paradigm with women's sports relative to men's sports, to just copy everything, as toxic as some of those things may be,
No, I get it.
on men's sports side. So I think it's worth thinking it through. I also, if you'll forgive sort of the personal plug, Lindsay D'Arcangelo does that all the time, thinks about it all the time. She's the real deal. So
Yeah, never
known her
apologize for plugging her in anything. She's a rock star. I love her. She's a reason why I started paying attention to women's sports for sure. And she told me too, like, don't look at it as anything different. And she mentioned being objective. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to think about. And it's interesting when you're writing this book, it stretches beyond just women in sports. And I'm not dumbing it down whatsoever, but throughout it, you're talking about the history. You mentioned the different eras. So what was part of that discovery when we're talking about, women voting and all this other stuff? Because it's beyond just sports. So what was something that kind of shocked you during some of the research?
Two things out of that. Number one, to your point, this is another reason why when you think it through as it relates to women's sports, the stakes are higher. The stakes are higher. When we are in a moment that women's rights are under attack, women's sports leagues are the tip of the spear for a lot of that fight in society writ large. And so I wouldn't say it shocked me as much as it was just a reinforcement of something that we see now in the moment, is that this has always been the case. And so I take you back
maybe
to,
it's shocking that it didn't shock you.
Well,
yeah,
you just see it again and again now. And so it's like, all right, well, this is the same battle that has always been. So you go back 1891, Dr. Naismith comes up with the rules of basketball. It's like, oh, well, when did women's basketball start? Right away. By 1892, there's collegiate women's basketball just as much as there is men's basketball. And by the late 1890s, there are sold out arenas and people literally banging on the ceiling to get in to see Stanford versus Cal women's basketball. What is the difference? Unlike men's basketball, which is given support, institutional opportunities, chances to thrive, there is a fight over the idea that women shouldn't even be allowed to play at all. We had a first lady, Herbert Hoover's wife, made it a fundamental part of her first lady portfolio to try and end intercollegiate women's sports, to protect women. And if that protect women sounds familiar, because you're seeing a lot of people using this to essentially try and attack trans athletes in sports, it's because it happens again and again and again. And once you see the regressive language, it's that much easier to kind of call it out and understand who these bad faith actors are. But the difference between the audience for men's basketball and women's basketball comes down to fundamentally the barriers that have been put in the way of women's basketball again and again. And so I kind of laugh when I hear people look purely at outcomes on this stuff and say, well, what about this gap in between? And the way I've always viewed it is, all right, let's go with equal funding and equal media attention and treat them both the same for an extended period of time. And then let's see where we're at, because even when we're not even close to that, we saw just in the last Final Four, so many more people watching the women's Final Four than the men's Final Four. I don't know that people fully realize what a miracle that is, given how many institutional barriers there are to women's sports through the years. But it says everything. It makes you wonder, oh my God, how much bigger would that gap have been in a truly equal fight?
And I wanted to read this excerpt from the book, and it was such a beautiful sentence. Quote, while men's sports have been watered and given sunlight every turn, women's sports have often been ostracized by decision makers at what have turned out to be critical moments in the evolution of American life. Wow. Gorgeous sentence. I would love for you to elaborate on that.
It is nothing less than inputs. If you are thinking about women's sports and you are talking about outcomes and not inputs, you are either intentionally acting in bad faith or just fundamentally missing the forest for the trees. And again, not to go too big picture on it, but in the same way that we've seen women's rights curtailed again and again, I mean, it's sort of amazing to think about, because you can flip it on its head and say, can you imagine a first lady of the United States making, as a part of her explicit platform, trying to end intercollegiate men's sports? Can you imagine
Yeah.
people trying to use pseudoscience to keep men's basketball from proliferating in the 1950s, which was a very, very common occurrence on the women's basketball side in the 1950s? Well, you go back to that period of time, think about that period of growth of George Mikan, of the NBA, which is in its infancy, trying to grow. These are things that stopped women's sports again and again. You can look at the fact that Title IX is more than 50 years old, and we still are seeing any number of ways in which Title IX is not fully funded at different colleges and universities. It is a problem again and again and again. And so it comes down to, if there is not that level of investment, we're not even talking at the pro level, where you compare Major League Soccer, which has run losses forever, and simply had significantly more runway from people who said, well, we need to invest over time. And the WNBA, for the first 2 decades especially, was treated by almost everyone as dollar in, dollar out. If we're not seeing immediate return on it, we're not going to continue to invest in it. And that's when you saw teams fold. That's where you saw teams. And then using that as a club against everyone else and saying, well, see, this one failure is representative of all the women's sports. That's a fun thing that people like to do, to say the successes are one-offs, but the failures, well, those are representative of all of women's sports. But look, Jess, you're a woman in media, and you're a woman in sports media. The same game is played in the same way is used against you and women across sports media as well. So this is, again, not a women's sports issue. This is a women in America issue.
And that's what's kind of interesting, is I think we often forget that. And because we just, and to be fair, my world is very sports driven. And so my mind goes to, like, I understand, like, it's rare that women are in the clubhouse, right? And I'm thankful for with the women before who let me be there. But I don't think about it from a perspective sometimes of, like, the other stuff going on. But then when you think about it, that's no different than what's going on out there as well. So do you think that when we're watching women's sports, it should be something that we're constantly thinking about? Because I think that kind of takes away some of the stuff away from it. I don't mean that in a negative way, like, of all people, I understand, but it's like, almost, if we kind of ignore that aspect, maybe we can enjoy it more. I don't know how to.
No. It's a great point, and it's really important, right?
Yeah.
There's those of us who have been doing this a minute on the women's sports side. There's a particular type of columnist that aggravates us the most, and it is the columnist who covers men's sports all the time, comes to a women's sporting event once, acts like he or she, and he usually has invented it, and writes the column, people should be paying more attention to this. And then the next 100 columns are about men's sports.
Yeah.
And it's aggravating as could be. And so my belief is, no, it's very much a show, not tell. It is very much, you keep showing up, you keep covering it, you treat it the same way, to the point that I've kidded with, there are coaches in women's college basketball who make a point, I know why they do this, to say at the end of their press conferences, thank you for showing up, we appreciate what you're doing for women's sports. And what I've said to multiple coaches there is, like, I can't wait for the moment where you don't have to do that anymore, because I covered the NBA for a long time, and there was no point at which LeBron James, who I think LeBron James is terrific and is wonderful at the media, but LeBron James never said to us at the end, I just want to thank you for all that you're doing for men's sports. Like, that never happens. And so that's where we need to get to, where it is assumed, it is common. And so it's okay to think about that. It's okay to, it animates certainly the way in which I've tried to shape my career in terms of what my area of focus is. But then we don't have to have a whole conversation of, oh, look, we're here. Isn't it amazing that we're here? It can be now like, we're here. You're amazing athletes. Let's cover it.
Yeah, I love that. And it's true too. Like, I know I get very romantic about, like, oh, I can't believe I get to cover this sport. but that barely happens, right? And I think there's kind of a beauty in it, like, let's just do it. And I can't wait to kind of delve more into women's sports, but it's no different than, like, I cover a team full time,
Yeah.
and I hate seeing national media show up out of nowhere. And I'm just like, where were you during the 112 loss season, XYZ? So I appreciate people like that. I also respect that, because when I go to another team or I go to another national thing and I'm the national person, there is a whole thing where I'm like, I make sure the, local media leads the scrums. Like, I don't care what flag I'm holding on that microphone. And it's one of those things too. And I've talked to Lindsay about this. Like, I don't think it would be right for me to just show up and say, like, oh, I cover men's sports, I deserve to be here. This is the same thing. Cause it is in certain aspects. But at the same, like, it's the same sport, but it's a different ball game, literally. So it's kind of like, I appreciate the people who are a little protective over it, but they're also embracing people too.
Yeah, no, I really think it's honestly is more of a gray area than that to me. And I'll just tell you from my perspective, which is to say that there must be an on-ramp for more people to come cover, right? If we're sitting here saying there needs to be more coverage, and then anyone who tries to add to that group, you say, oh, where were you, right?
Yeah.
Then you're blocking off the ability to do it. So I think there's a certain humility that you have to come with. I don't mean you specifically. I mean anyone who comes
you can mention me specifically.
No, but it's not you. I'm saying it's anyone who comes to a new sport, a new league, a new endeavor of any kind, where you hear, I think, people getting more protective is when somebody comes in and acts like that person has been there the whole time, and they are, I don't know the reason that Monica McNutt is a star instead of, like, Monica McNutt is a star because Monica McNutt is a star.
Yeah.
She hooped and was a 1,000-point scorer at Georgetown and worked and scratched and clawed and has done all of this work and has been in that space to get to this moment. And so I'm mentioning her name because I want to focus on the people who are doing that, right? There are going to be more and more people who come, and they should, and it's good, and it is what we ought to see. And again, the same dynamic's going to play through. Like you said, there are teams when they lose 112 games, the national reporters are not there. And then by definition, and it makes sense, the national stories are X as opposed to Y and Y as opposed to Z. But in a lot of ways, women's sports now coming to the forefront more and more, and people understanding the value of it is going to lead to more regular coverage, which makes it easier for more national reporters to show up, and also for local news organizations that are struggling to invest, as you know, in anything, to invest in women's sports specifically because, wow, here's a growth opportunity to be able to do it. There needs to be that on-ramp, just like on the fan base side. There needs to be, there's this, are you really an Indiana Fever fan? Can you name 5 players from the team 2 years ago that went 5-31? And it's like, why are we testing? They're here now. If Caitlin Clark brought them, okay, now you get to see the brilliance of Kelsey Mitchell, who's been doing this for almost a decade, and before that was wowing people at Ohio State. Not enough people, but has been amazing. Like, you're here and then stick around and come back for more. That doesn't strike me as something we need to be protective of. I think there needs to be that on-ramp. So I'm a big believer in that, in the same way I'm a big believer in, extending the ladder down as younger people are coming into our industry and making sure that they have opportunities. The thing you mentioned, the thing you said, you're in a scrum and you want local people to go first. And there are all these rules that you and I bring to it, right? I'm always thinking, I'm listening very carefully. Hey, did the local beat people, did they get the updates on injuries? Did they get what they're going to need for that day? Only before I get into, if I'm there for a feature, as I am for Baseball Prospectus, sometimes on the MLB side, then I'm asking that question. But there are young reporters who don't know. And instead of getting mad at the reporter for not knowing, to be able to say, let's have that conversation and let's try and help and mentor along the way. I'm a big believer in that, but I think it applies even more so to this women's sports moment.
I agree. I think I'm so glad you mentioned that. We had a young intern in the Chronicle, and she's very curious. And I love that about her. And same thing, like she asks me a billion questions and I'm like, ask me a billion more. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
And because I didn't have that when I first got started. Now I'm still asking a billion questions. Now I'm the annoying reporter who's been there forever, and that's okay.
That's the job. But by the way, just to that point, and I'll always remember, there were people who were very kind to me when I started in this business, and there were people who tried to Bigfoot you, you know. And I just always said, like, whatever happens, however I go forward, I'm going to be like those people who helped.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And even if, and I was the same way. I probably didn't have as many as I would have liked, but the people who were there, ride or dies forever. And I want to be their Susan Slusser, which I was lucky to have her. You want to talk about learning from the best. Nobody can mess with me now. You want to talk about, the GOAT. So when it comes to the WNBA, where is it now and where do you see it going?
Where it is now is at this huge inflection point, and things have worked out almost as if the WNBA would have scripted it, right? There are several elements here that are in play now and over the next couple of years. So let's just kind of take each in turn, right? There is a new media rights deal that has been agreed to, WNBA, as part of the overall NBA deal that exponentially increases the amount of money that the WNBA will have at its disposal beginning in 2025. And that means all kinds of things. That means the ability to invest more in infrastructure. That means that owners have more of a vested interest in investing their own money because there's more reward that comes on the other side of it. And potentially it means chance to pay players a lot more money. And so coincidentally, the WNBPA has the opportunity to opt out of the CBA that was signed in January of 2020, a very different time in women's basketball at the end of this season, which would trigger an end at the end of the 2025 season and begin a negotiation. And they've indicated they're likely to do so, but that suddenly means a sea change in what players are being paid. Before you even get into the off-season opportunities, whether it is Unrivaled, the new league that Nafisa Collier and Brianna Stewart are putting together, whether it's Athletes Unlimited, doing some really interesting things in a different model during the offseason. Suddenly, the need to play 12 months a year and play overseas for 7 months of it, which, leave aside from a professional perspective, is very challenging on the body. It is asking people in their 20s and 30s to go live in a different country for a majority of the year. It's from a personal and emotional development perspective, it is an unfair ask. And so we're seeing the circumstances of that changing fairly dramatically. Now you say, all right, what would be the best way to maximize what that media rights deal is going to look like? What would be the best way to put all that together? Oh, I don't know. Maybe the best ratings the WNBA has ever seen consistently time after time. That seems like pretty good timing. So you enter Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, and even that's a great. There are people who have argued, I think in bad faith, it is all Caitlin Clark, and that is absurd because the WNBA's ratings, you go back to the last couple of years, have already been on the upswing. There are people who say, well, it's not just Caitlin Clark, and it's worth noting that disproportionately we are seeing the Caitlin Clark audiences even larger. But if you pull Caitlin Clark out of the equation, you are seeing attendance up dramatically. You are seeing merch sales up dramatically. In all these different ways, there's a big jump, and then Caitlin Clark supersized that jump as well. So it's not an either or. It is very much a yes and. It's why, kind of the easiest tell are the people who are like, oh, well, it's Caitlin Clark or Angel Reese. And it's like, no, it's Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and about 140 other incredible basketball players. Come and learn their stories because it is a remarkable thing. The same way that, as you know, when we're in an MLB clubhouse, there's the most talked about player who has a very interesting story, but that player who had to struggle through the minor leagues to get there at age 28 and is maybe only going to be there for a few weeks, he's got a great story too.
Yeah, I'm a Grant Holmes girl. That guy was, 10 years. I'm a little annoyed that somebody else got to tell his story because, of course, he got traded. But that's okay. I will let him have his flowers. He deserves them.
You remember Pat Venditti? Pat
Of
Venditti was my
course, yeah.
favorite example of a guy. And for those who may not know, an ambidextrous pitcher who didn't get the chance to come to the major leagues. As I understand it, the New York Yankees didn't think it was becoming. It was New York Yankee enough. And ultimately, Pat stayed with it, fought through it, and had a significant major league career playing for a number of teams in MLB with that opportunity. I still remember talking, because I got to know Pat's wife, writing about Pat in the minor leagues. And the weekend that Pat got called up, she's on the phone with me, and I get to tell that story for a column I was writing, and she's crying on the phone.
Oh,
That's as meaningful to me as any World Series I've ever covered.
totally.
Yeah.
And I think about that too, like, and Stephen Vogt comes to mind, like,
Yes.
the baseball reference page is fine for me, but you and I won't be talking about what these guys were doing in those columns. And I mean, the baseball reference columns, we're talking about who they were as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephen Vogt, same thing. Like, yeah, like he wasn't the worst baseball player in the world, but you think about the reason why he's a manager is because of what he did as a player. And him especially being like an extension of Mark Kotze, who just started his managerial career, leaning on Stephen Vogt. We can obviously get into that like later on, but it's so interesting to think about that because just like you said, everybody has a story and those are only born if you start talking to people. And that's when all of this starts. And then same thing, like I'm a big proponent of, I can't make you fall in love with this player until I tell you something that has nothing to do with baseball.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tie baseball into stuff all the time, but I want my friends who couldn't care less about baseball to watch Mark Canha because I asked him about signing a potato for an autograph once, stuff
Yes.
like that.
And congratulations getting Mark Canha back on the West Coast.
Oh, I know. Bob's so excited. He's so stoked. I talked to
We
him the other
borrowed
day
him
about it.
for a couple of years here, but it does. And by the way, to your point, because this directly ties into women's sports too, which is that for so many years you would only be able to get, and I know this, I was on the freelance side pitching it to legacy outlets. Oh, well, what's the off the court thing? Because people don't care about the on the court thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or the on the court thing had to be a superlative like we have never seen before. It wasn't enough to just be excelling. And the point with those stories, like you said, is there needs to be the structure and the superstructure. There needs to be, people care about Steph Curry's daughter in part because they know about Steph Curry's brilliance. And then Steph Curry's brilliance means people are interested in Steph Curry's daughter. And it is this feed, it is this loop. And so I am a big believer with that as well, that, and the WNBA players talk about this, more than an athlete. And that's the right framing for it, which is to say that more than an athlete, but yes, an athlete too. And having both parts of that be covered regularly enough for people to understand it, to know it, to be in the bloodstream of how people are following sports is vital for it to happen. No one has to explain to anyone who Steph Curry is on the court because the NBA is covered all the time. And I think that is wonderful. But the same thing, people should not have to be told what Caitlin Clark is on the court. And then you get the off the court as well that goes along with it.
Yeah. And that's always kind of fun too, because I remember when I was with NBC Sports, I could talk about Steph Curry taking a breath and like, we have to write that. And I'm like, all right, cool. Like it was easy to do because, people were going to read it and it wasn't too clickbaity because you just know that people are going to want to consume that. And it's because it's Steph Curry. Like you want to know everything. And you're right. We know what he can do on the court. So let's take care of everything else that people might not know.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about Lindsay Whalen on a podcast recently, and I really resonated with this. And because she went from hockey to basketball, and that was kind of an interesting dynamic because you talked about her parents were a little worried about like not making friends. And it was because this was before women's hockey. So there was no opportunity for her in women's hockey. I had to switch from baseball to softball for those reasons. I couldn't continue my baseball career, not like I was going to be playing right now, but I didn't know softball existed until I need the collegiate opportunity. Yeah. So when you're thinking about those situations, what comes to mind? Because these people had to make decisions that men didn't have to make because hockey was already there.
It is as simple as that. It is choice. It is opportunity. I hear your story and I think, thank God for Justine Siegel and Baseball for All,
It's my
because
girl.
they have created a pipeline, as you know, and we're seeing it right now. The Women's Baseball World Cup is happening right now. Kelsey Whitmore right now is crushing it as a two-way player. Elise Berger, who I'm so delighted is coming to Bard College to pitch. She's going to be the first woman on the baseball team this upcoming year. She is crushing it as well on the mound. And that choice was not necessary to be made for Elise to play in college. But as recently as when Kelsey was in college, Kelsey ended up playing softball at Cal State Fullerton for the same reason. And so this was the case even in women's basketball. And you see it in the book and you see it generation by generation. And so to your point, Peps Newman wanted to play pro basketball. That was her dream in high school. And she had a principal at her school say, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Said it to her, said it to anyone who would listen. By the way, the gym there is now named after Peps Newman. So she created a barnstorming team of women's basketball players who ran a profitable business for 25 years. I mean, just an incredible success story that people don't talk about because, gee, if you do, then it opens the door to, why isn't there more? You go a generation beyond that. Cheryl Reeve, before she was the head coach of USA Basketball, before she led the Minnesota Lynx to all these WNBA titles, Cheryl Reeve was a basketball player at LaSalle because she talked to her high school coach. She was excellent at softball as well. And by the way, she played baseball growing up. Probably would have been able to stick with baseball. I talked to, friends of hers from high school who she's still close with. They think she was a better softball player than she was a basketball player. But where was the greater opportunity for scholarships? Basketball. So that shaped her career. And again, she laughs about it. I've asked her and she says, well, it worked out pretty well for me. And it did. But to be fair, not for everyone, not for a lot of people. And so the players of the year here in South Jersey, where I am, and in Philadelphia, it was this rite of passages. And they were just like so sad to come across as I'm going through this research. There's a hotel about 5 minutes away from my house where they honor the women's athlete of the year in college. And you say, oh, what are you doing now? Well, I guess I'm going back to school to become a CPA, or I'm going to become a nurse practitioner because there's nowhere for me to go. And it just ends. Like the path stops. And so to your point, we have no idea like how long you would have played baseball, but you didn't get that choice. You didn't get that.
I would have loved the chance to mess it up in my own way. Yeah.
And why not? Why shouldn't every woman who wants to play have the same opportunity? And by the way, not for nothing, but if we're talking about Title IX, if we're talking about true equality of opportunity, I love softball. I have nothing against softball. It's a different sport than baseball.
Thank you.
A different sport than baseball. And this idea that, well, it's fine because we can just send you to a different track. And by the way, a different track that they're looking down on. They're basically saying, well, you can't play baseball. For so many people who are sending young women in the direction of softball, there is that inherent thought. And that is toxic in and of itself. I would argue, what kind of message does that send to young women in America, regardless of equality of opportunity and regardless, frankly, of the law? It's a huge problem. I love I don't mean to go back to Justine Siegel, but Baseball for All built it the right way. They built U8s, U10s, U14s, U18s. Like they built a pipeline. And now we're seeing that happen time and time again. We're seeing professional baseball include women like Beth Greenwood, who came up through Baseball for All, played at University of Rochester. She was a trailblazer there on their baseball team, the way Elise Berger is about to be at Bard. And now here she is coaching at Jersey Shore. And I get to see her whenever I go down for the minor leagues. I mean, it's just an incredible thing to see. But how does it happen? I mean, again, it's inputs. It's inputs.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot more that like I'd make new friends. I had to start from scratch, and I learned how to hit all over again. Like as a sophomore in high school, when you're figuring out who you are and you want to be cool and you want to make friends, like my childhood friends, I had to make new friends, and it was weird. I hated it. So there was more than just figuring out the sport. That was the most minute part of it all.
And I didn't answer your question properly. I apologize about Lindsay
No,
Whalen.
you're good.
But with Lindsay Whalen, it was very much another thing. Oh, this worked out pretty well for her, you might say, all these Hall of Fames and championships later, right? But at the same time, Lindsay Whalen loved hockey, loves it to this day. And man, the PWHL was around at that time, would have been a very different potential career. And we're not even getting into like multi-sport stars. There's an opportunity to be able to see that. I grew up seeing Deion Sanders playing baseball and football and Bo Jackson playing baseball and football. And I can't wait to see that happen as well in women's sports. The reason it's going to potentially happen is because there need to be professional opportunities in these multiple sports.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Before I let you go, if somebody wants to purchase Rare Gems, how would they go about that?
Anywhere books are sold, bookshop.org, amazon.com's got it. You can buy directly from Triumph Publishing. I will say we've also been offering all summer long a 30% off code for those of you who subscribe to the Next. So the nexthoops.com, where we have over 100 reported pieces on women's basketball every month. You subscribe, it's $9 a month, $72 a year. It all gets sent to your inbox, so you can see it all happening in real time, and you get a code for 30% off of Rare Gems as you do it. So my personal belief is that's the best way to do it, because that allows for the full immersion into the women's basketball experience.
Yeah, it's a one-stop shop. I love that.
That's right.
Howard, you've been amazing. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Such an honor. Thank you for having me.
That was Howard Megdal. Make sure you track down his book, Rare Gems, How 4 Generations of Women Paved the Way for the WNBA. You want to talk about an advocate for women's sports. I also really appreciate the fact that he is a fair reporter. If you're going to cover sports, cover each and every one of them the same. Don't be biased. Don't be, don't sugarcoat things. I think that's what's really important here too. And that was something I learned early on in my reporting. If somebody's going 0 for 9, they know that they're going 0 for 9. And I'm glad that he understands that as well. Thank you so much for tuning in to Short and to the Point here on Awful Announcing and the Comeback. For Philip, this is Jessica Kleinschmidt, and we'll see you next time.
Want even more short and to the point? Follow Jessica at KleinschmidtJD and head over to thecomeback.com and awfulannouncing.com.